Hello and welcome to Newspeak, the New Culture Forum's weekly current affairs programme. This week we are joined by cultural historian and NCF senior fellow Philip Kiszely and the director of the New Culture Forum, Peter Whittle. So let's begin this week by kicking off with this discussion surrounding the MP Lee Anderson's comments about food banks. And also a couple of days later, a whole hubbub that was kicked up around Rachel Maclean, the safeguarding minister's comments that she made about people needing to essentially go and find more work, take on more hours, or find a higher paid job to deal with the cost of living crisis.
But what was it he actually said? What's the big problem?
So Lee Anderson made some comments in a speech in Parliament where he was talking about food banks, particularly in his local area. He was saying that they have this scheme where they essentially teach people how to budget and how to cook on a lower budget and how to shop on a lower budget. And then he invited other MPs to come to his constituency to see this food bank where he works himself. He's donated money to it in the past, has helped them with food deliveries, that kind of thing. The headlines following this speech in Parliament were saying things like Conservative MP or Tory MP says that the poor can't cook. And people were up in arms about this. There was outrage, condemnation, because his comments were essentially, in my opinion, were misrepresented. And then we see a couple of days later, Rachel Maclean is doing this interview, I believe it was with Sky News, and she says that in order to deal with the rising cost of living and the crisis there, that people should take on, in order to protect themselves, should take on more working hours and should look for a higher paid job. Except that wasn't really what she was saying. She said that she recognised that some people weren't able to do this, and that was the reason why the government needed to and were right to invest in other measures as well. But she was being portrayed as having suggested that this is just what people need to do. So it was a portrayal again of the nasty Tory, and I think Lee Anderson was worse. The misrepresentation of his comments, I think, was worse.
Although I seem to remember when I actually saw it on the TV, I think it was or wherever it was, he does say something like, "A lot of people don't know how to cook." Right? He said that. He did say that.
Which out of context may look bad.
Yeah, but it's a kind. That's true. Obviously, a lot of people don't. I think in a way that I would say it's one of those issues where it's almost no point in trying to cling to logic or any of that stuff. If a Tory MP, even one from the Red Wall, who's not got a silver spoon in his mouth, says something like that, they are going to kind of go for him, which I understand as well has happened since then with this situation with Jack Monroe, the cook Jack Monroe, who isn't that right? She's threatening to sue him or something,
yes.
Or is suing him something.
I mean, with this, immediately after this, Norman Tebbit was trending, wasn't he? So it's so he was, but it's so lazy, isn't it? Just it's this Tory trope that you can just jump on and then it's bash the Tories or bash the right wing.
So this is what my question is, and I think that what this raises is and should be raising is a conversation around honesty in public debate and the way that these tropes influence people's knee-jerk reactions. So Lee Anderson is being represented as Jack Monroe did, as this white, rich, privileged male Tory, even though Lee Anderson used to work down the pit. He's a miner, he comes from, I think it's Ashfield. He's a real working class man who understands the problems and the plights of the working classes. And he himself has worked closely with this food bank. As he said, he's donated his own money and he's worked with them. So he understands these problems. But at the same time, Jack Monroe, and this is the reason why he's being sued, because he said basically that she makes money, and I don't want us to get sued by Jack Monroe because she seems to be quite a litigious lady, or she's non-binary, but anyway. So she criticised him in this way because he had said that she was making money. I'm paraphrasing here, making money off of the poor people who buy her cookbooks, because Jack Monroe, very much like Lee Anderson, she writes these cookbooks. One of them's called Cooking on a Bootstrap, another one's called Tin Can Cook. She writes cookbooks for people who are she's put it, I believe, or the Guardian has put it, living in an age of austerity. So, and she sent these herself to food banks. So she seems to me on face value that she's doing and suggesting exactly the same thing as Lee Anderson that people could do with help to cook on a budget.
It's classic identity politics nonsense, isn't it? Where, you know, you'll throw the white privilege blanket thing at someone because they're white, and it doesn't matter if they're from Barnsley, they're working class, they've had 2 generations of unemployment. It's just that they're white, a male probably, you know. Whereas if someone has some kind of identity characteristic that is, you know, for want of a better word, trendy, then they're perfectly good and virtuous, and we must listen to them. It's classic nonsense. I think that's one thing. I think the other thing is that it actually feeds into a broader narrative. I think you're right here about dishonesty, because that's fundamentally what it's about. But I think there's a broader narrative here about people don't actually know how to cook, because people don't sit down to dinner together. People don't communicate with each other over dinner. That isn't part of family life anymore, or isn't like it used to be. And I think that's a really important thing. It doesn't necessarily feed directly into class, but it feeds into something else. And maybe it's too broad to bring this in, but it's the disintegration of family and values and all of those things, which I think are really important.
It seems to me as well that these 2 cases have something in common, which is that Lee Anderson and Rachel McLean are both suggesting really an approach that focuses on individual responsibility. That yes, we may be faced with all of these problems. You may have to go to a food bank because of issues, or even struggle with work, because even if you're working every hour God sends, as the interviewer put it, that the interviewer was interviewing Rachel McLean, you know, that they are, both of them, suggesting what I think is a conservative principle, which is that you need to take personal responsibility. And even if circumstances are bad, and sometimes circumstances will be bad, that there are some things that you can do to help yourself. And that Lee Anderson, in my opinion, was suggesting the old give a man a fishing rod rather than a fish, help people to be able to help themselves. Because I know for a fact that if I had to shop and then cook on a budget of 30 pence a meal, I wouldn't know how to do it. And if I was in that situation, would probably benefit from some advice in that department. So I think partly it's tropes, but also there's this whole sensitivity around a Tory talking about poverty full stop, because they're held responsible for it.
And as far as she was concerned, it was one thing. She said you can do various things, one of which, if you can, you could maybe work some extra hours. And that would be one of the first things that anybody would think about anyway. Oh, is there an opportunity to earn more money? If there is, then I'll do that. If there isn't, and I can't because I've got children to look after, I've got other things to do, then I can't. But she was only just saying, well, that's one option, and it seemed completely fair enough.
I think, I mean, on the broader point as well that you were saying about truth in discussion, I mean, I think it is impossible, but also I think it's always pretty much been like that. I mean, if you, going back, say, like 30, 40, 50 years, if you said there's no such thing anymore as real absolute poverty, you would get it in the neck. I mean, absolutely. There's nothing new about that, even if you weren't necessarily conservative. But a majority of people, I would say, could tell that in the terms of the poverty that they knew and grew up with, older generations, that in fact that kind of poverty had pretty much gone. I mean, you know, that I think essentially around about 1960, even Labour, the Labour Party, accepted this and changed the definition of what was actually poverty to something much more relative.
Well, that's the thing. That's what we're actually dealing with primarily. I know there are outliers, but primarily we're dealing with relative poverty, aren't we?
Yeah, exactly. But the thing is, this truth, and it just reminds me of that famous quote of Thatcher's, when she said to a magazine, "There's no such thing as society," right? Everybody knows that now. Everyone. There was no point in trying to correct. If you look at the quote, it was, I think, to Woman's Weekly or Woman's Own.
Woman's Own, I think it was, yeah.
She said something like, there's no such thing as society. There are men and women and families. The point was at that time, you don't hear it so much now, but at that time people used to say an awful lot, it's society's fault. You used to hear it, it's a sick society, all of that kind of thing. You'd hear that, well, it's society doesn't. And she was more or less responding to that. There's no, what is this society thing? But of course, there's no point in trying to correct that now. That's absolutely there. I think all that Lee Anderson could be basically, accused of, if anything, is just being a bit naive. I mean, that, you are going to be misrepresented entirely. There's no question about it. People, we know, you're on Twitter a lot, people carry on with misrepresentations long after they've even been put right.
How do you think, what is your opinion on how politicians can, not just politicians but public figures, can survive in an age where you have to assume that everything you said will be misrepresented by a bad faith party?
I think one of those things is that these things are often storms in a teacup. It's a rolling news feed, isn't it? So tomorrow there'll be something else, and then the day after there'll be something else, and most people will forget it. And the people who don't, they're going to hold a grudge anyway. They're going to hold a grudge anyway.
Well, that's the point. That's the point. It sounds so complacent and everything, but after a certain time, you sort of look at these things and you sort of think, well, he's saying what he would say, she's saying what she would say, and they're writing what they would write, blah, blah, blah. Oh, let's wait till the next time, and so it goes round and round.
And most people, I would imagine most people watching this, and I certainly felt this when I read the story, I just automatically assumed that it was false. I just automatically assumed that it was false. Reading the headline before I'd even read it, I thought, oh yeah, that's more Tory bashing.
And that dishonesty is, in exactly the way that you just described, must be having some kind of impact.
Oh, I think
not
so.
only on people's public trust in the mainstream media, but in political parties more generally, because nobody knows. You have to assume an element of dishonesty or bad faith on the part of every any person telling you anything, that there seems to be it almost as if truth has no place in the public. Do you think that truth has no place in the public debate anymore?
I don't think it has no place. I think it's our good old friend postmodernism has done that to an extent. That essentially, so that's what
all
you think.
roads lead to postmodernism.
Yes, exactly. That's what you think. That's the kind of thing. So what? That's just your opinion. You say, well, actually, wait a minute. That's actually the verifiable truth or not. That's where this has led us. I think, politically speaking, I think it's. I do think it's much more, therefore, more superficial. I mean, I don't know when it stopped being. I can think of the difference in politics, for example, in the 1980s, when there were real battles to be had, whichever side you were on. I think there was a sincerity to it on both sides, actually. I think that's what's gone now. It's just like very superficial.
And I think it's superficial. I think you're absolutely right. I think it's damaging to people as well, because what people tend to do is, it's the old, when God's gone, people will believe in anything, and when truth's gone, people will believe in anything. So they won't trust the mainstream media with very good reason, but they'll go to any conspiracy theory on the internet because it's different and because it presents an alternative narrative, and therefore it must be the truth.
And also, if you're constantly affirming people's perceptions and everything is based on perception, then why wouldn't you just hunt out sources that affirm your perception regardless of their basis in fact? You would imagine that all of this talk of fake news and conspiracy theories, that actually it's this subjectivism that's driving people towards it.
Yeah, and I'm not having a go at people there, actually. It's completely understandable in lots of ways. Not on the extremes, but it's completely understandable in lots of ways, because we all want to affirm what we think, don't we? And if we're being bombarded by news and information that is patently absurd, white privilege, for example, patently absurd, then you're going to look elsewhere, and of course you're going to be susceptible to anything that's out there, and for me that's really damaging. That's tragic.
I think as well, just one thing to add to that actually, which is when I was talking about postmodernism, Yes, there is that, of course. But then we've had very specific sort of lying in recent times. So if you go back to Brexit, and people don't forget this, they might not even walk around consciously thinking of it, but it goes into their subconscious. So when we were told by the chief Remain people, i.e. the Prime Minister and the Chancellor Exchequer, that we would have an immediate recession, for example, when there would be colossal job losses. I remember the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, saying there would be 500,000 jobs going from the city, for example. Those are seemingly verifiable claims which turn out to be utterly untrue. So when people have had that, then they're going to be more susceptible, aren't they, to more outlandish explanations.
But I mean, just to finish that point, it's the hypocrisy of the whole thing. So people like Sadiq Khan will make those kinds of claims, and the left and those kinds of people will say, yes, absolutely. Oh well, that's possible. That's our truth. It's absolutely. If Donald Trump was making those kind of claims, it would be outrageous. It's the end of truth, and they're the ones who deconstructed truth in the first place.
Again, it's based on the speaker
it's
rather
based
than
on the speaker
what's spoken.
than what's spoken. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Also, I mean, sorry, warming to my theme here, but same thing with
We're going to warm to it further.
No. The same thing is with there's no question about it, with the pandemic. You know, if you're just sort of reading the newspapers, watching the news, you would sort of think, why aren't the journalists sort of like asking about where this thing came from? Yeah. One of the most important things, surely any self-respecting journalist would immediately think, well, we've got to find out where this thing originated. Yes. And they just showed amazing lack of curiosity about it. Yeah. Now, of course, it's actually quite mainstream to say that this might well have been a leak from the Wuhan Institute. But something that seemed quite obvious to most sentient people.
Yeah. Well,
you've got this leak, and Donald Trump, the
yes,
Chinese.
Exactly. Yes,
exactly. It's an obvious thing to say, but he was absolutely pilloried for it.
Yes.
To add to that as well, and I won't go into it too much detail now because maybe it's something for another time, but there's been a lot of discussion in the last couple of weeks about this World Health Organization treaty that countries may be signing up to, including the United Kingdom. Going back to the point about misinformation, that there was a point during the pandemic where whether something was misinformation or not was defined by whether or not it was the opinion of the World Health Organization, even though they changed their mind multiple times. And things that had previously been regarded as conspiracy theories, like the lab leak, and therefore regarded as misinformation and flagged up with all sorts of warnings on social media, then became something that was being reported on by the mainstream media when suddenly they discovered their curiosity for it after there was a public appetite for it.
And this is why I say, I'm not having a go here at people who believe in conspiracy theories, because often, as we know, conspiracy theories become, they're actually true. But yeah, I mean, it's an excellent
But
point.
even the ability to pick out the difference between malign conspiracy theories and the lack of willingness to discuss certain subjects, those two things go hand in hand. So yet again, people will be pushed into exploring other alternative explanations for things because they're unable to join the dots themselves by legitimate means.
Well, that's the word. That these things have all lost their legitimacy. That's the crucial thing.
So moving on to something that's lost its legitimacy, higher education.
Thank you.
There's one for you.
Just the man.
So in the news this week, it's been reported that a government source has criticised this equality scheme that universities have signed up to. Eric Kaufman described it. It's by an organisation called Advance HE. And the scheme is called the Racial Charter Scheme, and it's been compared by Eric Kaufman to the Stonewall of race. So this scheme, it's working very much like the Stonewall Diversity Champion Scheme. It provides advice to universities who pay it in order to be, guided to make their places more equal. Whether
and you end up with a kind of medal.
Well, there is a league table where people can get gold, silver, bronze, something to that effect. And so this has been criticised by a government source for being egregious wokery. And there's been discussion around how this has changed the cultural landscape on campus, how they had provided advice to universities to stamp out microaggressions and used examples of things like not looking at people in the eye when you're talking to them, which I find interesting as well, because at the same time we've got Sadiq Khan telling us that staring is a hate crime too, so you can imagine people sort of not knowing what to do with their eyes.
I think raising your eyebrows is a microaggression.
And walking away when someone's talking, not listening properly, that kind of thing. And so this report suggests that millions of taxpayer money through universities is going to paying this scheme.
Plus, also, presumably, the scheme is also publicly funded?
I think Advance HE, and I may be wrong on this, I think they used to receive government funding but no longer do, but they would still be receiving tax money via the universities because the universities
are paying for them.
Yeah. Have you heard of it?
Yes, I've heard of it, but for me, the big issue is the money, the money being squandered on it, I would say. But I don't think it's really changing anything. I think actually to say that it's changing cultures in university is to way overstate the case, because the cultures are already there. It might accelerate them a little bit, and it might kind of broaden them, but believe me, the culture is there. The microaggression culture, the wokery is there. And
what is the primary, if this isn't the primary driver of cultural change on campus, where is that coming from? I know that's quite a big question that goes back decades, but how much of an influence do these lobby groups, and well, they would say that they're not a lobby group, they'd say they're an educational charity, but how much do these sorts of organisations and these sorts of schemes and programmes affect the culture on campus? Or is that change being driven from somewhere else? Is it being driven by the student body, by academics?
It's really, really complicated, obviously, because universities respond to their environment, but also universities drive change. So the ideas in universities filter out into the environment, but the environment comes onto campus. The people who are running Advance HE are the people who were at university probably yesterday, So again, I come back to this idea. I'm not really answering that question very well, because I'm not sure I can, to be honest. But I don't think there's much of a dividing line between the two. It's almost, if it were in any other context, people would be saying, my God, this is ridiculous that we're paying you to tell us how to behave. And it's got really nothing to do with education, but it's got everything to do with education, because this is what's happening in universities, right? It's all about identity, it's all about aggressions, it's all about victimhood, it's all about those kinds of things. And what's happening is actual subjects, actual disciplines are disappearing, or they're becoming marginalised. So what you learn about is how I'm a victim because of the colour of my skin, how I'm a victim because of my sexuality, how I'm a victim because of my gender, and then how can I apply that to a subject, and how can I destroy that subject, or destroy the history of that subject, destroy the Western history of that subject with all of these things. So what it's doing is helping that process along, but it's not really changing anything. As I say, I come back to the original point, because it was already there.
So one of the things that Advance HE strive to do is to help universities or at least this is what
decolonise.
What it seemed through the media reports is that they want to help universities decolonise their curriculum, that kind of thing, and they say that they don't force universities to. This is like an opt-in thing. How do you think that this kind of activity, whether it's Stonewall or whether it's Advanced HE, how does that affect people's ability to learn? Because I know obviously there's been a lot in the media recently around Cambridge University putting these trigger warnings on things, or they call them content notes. Same thing with a different name.
Trigger warning on
Little House on the Prairie.
Little House on the Prairie.
Little House on the Prairie.
Do you think this affects people's ability, or students' ability to learn? Because they say it's actually facilitating students to have equal access to their education.
Yeah, I think that's a fudge, and I think that's a lie. I think if
we're back to dishonesty.
if you're approaching a text like Little House on the Prairie, prairie, not prairie, and you're approaching it in fear, okay, how are you going to approach Coriolanus? Or how are you going to approach Macbeth? Or how are you going to approach Othello, right? The answer is you're not going to approach them because they're just being completely expunged from the
and
from
presumably,
the
if you felt it was going to cause you too much psychological distress, you could walk away from
You
it
could walk
entirely, and they
away.
wouldn't force you to study it or
You see,
be
the things.
exposed to it.
Sorry to break into, but I just feel with these things, there's a lot of trigger warnings in that particular thing about advanced AG. They're going to put them on almost everything. I think this is all done in entirely bad faith on everyone's part. I don't think people are really triggered by these things. I don't think they're really offended by these things. I don't think that the people who put them on think that they are triggerable, if you know what I mean. I think this is entirely a cover for something else, which is to delegitimize the Western canon. It's as simple as that. And I don't believe that anyone who says they're offended is offended.
So
Well,
the-
I suppose that's what I'm saying in a way,
Yeah.
really, isn't it? So, you know, Little House on the Prairie, there's a trigger warning. So we can't have Coriolanus because that's just too much, you know. And so they've got to go. And that's how it works. It starts in small ways. It starts with fear. You know, but it also starts with, oh well, let's do something different. Let's look at things in a different kind of way. And I know I'm going off point here, but it's difficult to stay on point because everything feeds into the same thing. Do you understand what I mean?
I don't think it is off point because I think a significant aspect of this is that it plants this corrupting idea that I think is antithetical to education, that you shouldn't feel uncomfortable. If I, as a student reading Nietzsche or Dostoevsky, hadn't felt uncomfortable, deeply uncomfortable, then I wouldn't be the person I am now. I felt profoundly changed by reading those texts when I was a teenager. And I think that actually feeling uncomfortable, they paint it as, you know, this sort of discomfort is not antithetical to academic freedom and curiosity, that actually providing these content notes is about academic freedom, which I think is also a dishonest fudge. I think that actually a part of curiosity generally, never mind just intellectual curiosity, is the willingness to put yourself in uncomfortable positions in order to discover new things.
Well,
and if that corrupting idea that you shouldn't feel uncomfortable is smuggled in the heart of education at the very, very beginning of an undergraduate's career by content notes and trigger warnings and things, then the sort of person that they will be when they leave university is a very different sort of person they would be if that hadn't been the case.
If you never feel uncomfortable, then you're easily controlled, right? And a major part of creating new knowledge is to be on a dangerous frontier.
It's part of being intellectually independent.
It's part of being intellectually independent, but it's exciting as well. It's exciting to discover new knowledge, and you can't discover new knowledge. It's like discovering a new land. You don't know what's going to be there. It could be incredibly hostile. Truth can be a very terrible thing, but it's incredibly exciting. And as human beings, we've really got to push the frontiers. We've got to go to these new lands. And what this ethos is saying is it's no, Emma, come back.
Well,
Stay in your comfort zone. Stay in your comfort zone. That isn't what education's about.
The only thing that would be left would be to just traipse over the same material that's already been done, the same thinking, the same ideas, to just keep going over and over it, because anything outside of that might feel uncomfortable.
Well, in a way, that's what it's about, isn't it? It's emphasising and re-emphasising and re-implanting the same ideas. It's rote.
So before we move on to the next subject, quickly, do you think that the government have, and I know that you don't agree with this, Peter, but the government have at least attempted to look as if they are dealing with
I'd agree on that.
wokery.
They have attempted to look as though they are, yes.
So this was a government source that was criticising this programme. They called it egregious wokery. Do you think that as part of the government's proposed changes to deal with some of this stuff, that this kind of scheme, the scheme like Advanced HE is here, this racial charter scheme, or the Stonewall Diversity Champion scheme, do you think that the government should take measures to ban that sort of engagement with universities as a way to prevent this kind of
yes, I think so. I mean, I don't know whether banning is the right way to go about it, but basically they should, you know, they should discourage it. I mean, at every opportunity. Certainly don't give them, like in the case of
it somehow.
Well, in the case of Stonewall, there's a lot of public money, so it gets it, as I said, from both ends. You know, it gets the money in the first place, and it gets these. Basically, what are ideological trip advisors, aren't they? That's what they are.
That's the thing. I think it just needs reframing, right?
Yeah.
So at the moment, it's framed in terms of well-being and inclusivity. It just needs to be reframed and called out for what it is, which is ideology. Yeah. Now, they wouldn't for 1 minute let you know, a charity that was right-wing, Burkean, traditionalist conservatives in there to completely rearrange things. So why would they allow hard, radical, because that's what it is. I mean, we're going to talk about BLM, I think, aren't we? But that's exactly what it is. Hard, radical left ideologists coming in and imposing their thoughts and ideas on students, staff and everybody else.
Perhaps that's what they should do then. They should say, the university will not get any more taxpayer money if you can continue to use these schemes, but if you do, you won't be receiving any taxpayer money because the government can't fund ideology.
Yeah, I think that's the answer.
No, they absolutely shouldn't. And the you know, not just the universities, but the actual groups themselves, I keep saying this, should not get any more taxpayers' money. Why should my money go to Stonewall or to Advance AG or any of these kind of... Why should my tax dollars?
I think one of the things about this as well is the more oxygen of publicity these things get, the better, actually. Because I said this, actually, in a Heresies film that I made a few weeks ago. People are only just beginning to fully understand what's going on in the institutions, you know, what's going on in the civil service or what's going on in the army, for God's sake, but certainly what's going on in education. They've got this idea that, it's all a bit crazy and it's all a bit woke and, yeah, sure. No, it's much, much more than that.
So while we're on that subject, also in the news this week, was a story of a schoolgirl who had been hounded out of education. She's now having to do her A-levels at home because she took part in a debate where she questioned trans ideology, and 60 students ganged up on her, were apparently screaming. I think the report said that they were spitting at her. She was hounded out. She's now been defended by J.K. Rowling, who's come to her defence. But this girl is now having to continue her education at home. And from the news reports, it also looks as if, though initially supporting her, the teachers have withdrawn their support from the girl. And that Owen Jones tweeted, I was going to phrase this in a way that could potentially be libelous, so I won't. But Owen Jones put out a tweet, and I'm sure we can put that up on the screen as well, that basically asked for the bully's perspective on what had taken place, and in doing so, really he rallied his followers to set out to get this girl. It's the way that it's been perceived online anyway. So it just seems to be a perfectly abhorrent example of how this situation is escalating in education, that a girl can't even question trans ideology within the context of a debate.
No, I mean, this is exactly it. This is the effect. This is what you get. This is diversity. Okay, gangs of people bullying people because they don't think the right they don't think the right way. You know, so this idea of demythologizing and let's get rid of all the taboos and all of that kind of thing. That's not really what happens. You just make something else taboo, and it's about ideas, and you know, it's the absolute antithesis of diversity. It really is. This idea of diversity is not diverse at all.
I think actually the girl in question, she's better off at home.
Yeah.
Actually, I mean, I don't know the ins and outs of it. I mean, I don't know anything more about her circumstances or anything. But frankly, increasingly, you know, the time is going to come where people think, how on earth can we homeschool people? It must be one of the hardest things, you know. But there's going to come a point where I think you're not going to let your kids, I mean, be subjected to this kind of thing. Not just from their kind of classmates who basically, you know what kids are like at that age? I don't know, they're teenagers, right?
Yeah.
They kind of, they can be absolutely vile at that age, really go for the one who's standing up for something.
Yeah.
The last thing they're going to do is support them. But it's the way in which the teachers have obviously indoctrinated them. And the teachers, of course, now are absolutely backing away from it all, as you would know that they would. I think that, eventually, if we can't produce our own institutions, the only thing for it is for kids to be sort of homeschooled. How do you do it with parents who don't have much money?
I was thinking.
I mean, that's the point, actually, isn't it? This really feeds into this class question, which is absolutely at the heart of it as well, and which never ever gets addressed. Okay, it's actually easy for wealthy parents, or easier for wealthy parents, to take children out of the system and educate them at home.
Particularly if you've got a university education.
Particularly if you've got a university education and you've got the money to do that. But, what if you haven't? What if you are having to work 2 jobs? What if you are having to look at, you've got extended family living in the house because they can't live anywhere else? People talk about equity, people talk about equality, rubbish.
It's another way as well. It's another indication of how precarious it is to be reliant on the state.
Yeah.
That if the state are educating your children, and I don't know what sort of school this young lady was at, but I suppose my question would be whether, on the one hand, this might actually turn a lot of young people off of this ideology if they see that their classmates are turning into bullies because they're turning into almost like the sort of Maoist recruits who are trying to...
I don't think it will, actually, Emma.
Because actually the opposite seems to be true. If 60 students were condemning her in this way, that is a very, very worrying sign and an indictment of the education system.
Many of those kids as well will have taken this on board as a kind of fad fashion, and probably half of them call themselves non-binary. Apparently this is a real thing now, or lesbian, or whatever it might be, or trans, or whatever. And so essentially it's the latest thing. The difference is that they're being aided and abetted and indeed inspired by the teachers, as opposed to being against
Schools
them.
are supposed to teach British values as well. That's something that they have to do. Yeah. And obviously this could just be an interpretation of the meaning of tolerance, that they believe it's intolerant to question trans ideology, rather than interpreting it that you should be tolerant of other people's opinions. And perhaps that's something that, I don't know, I'm disinclined to say that, Ofsted should step in or this should be something for the DFE, but when talking about British values and tolerance, surely tolerance of other people's speech should be important. And if schools have to teach students critical thinking, this shows that whatever they're teaching them as critical thinking or tolerance or British values clearly is not what is meant by the spirit of British values.
The problem is critical thinking and critical theory are synonymous in schools, and of course they're completely different things. I think there's one other thing as well, and I completely agree that, kids can be dreadful at that age, but if all they've ever known is this constant, one-dimensional, very clear message all the time, if they are told that that's virtuous, that's right, this is how you behave, the grown-ups say it, parents say it, they see it in the media, they see it everywhere, okay? How is a 14-year-old, equipped to kind of go against that? Now, luckily, children are kind of rebellious by nature, often. So the child who's being rebellious there, good on her, but many aren't, and you can't expect
it's
them
almost
to
worryingly
be.
conformist that there's not more rebellion against these views now that they're the status quo.
Have you ever watched this libs on TikTok? Libs of TikTok. I mean, basically they're just these like crazy nut jobs, right? Basically pontificating about politics. They're mostly American, actually, but the number of them that are teachers is frightening. Either what we would call it primary school and secondary school, they call it first grade.
The person who runs Libs of TikTok got doxxed, partly because by posting these things online, it caused change in America, because it alerted parents to the state of the education system. They suddenly realised, oh my God, these people are teaching our children. This is where these ideas are coming from.
But again, this is a byproduct that I said before. Not all social media is bad. If it can offer an insight into what's going on, then people will say, well, I don't want this. I don't want my child to go to this particular university. That's the other thing as well. It's being savvy and looking at what's on offer, because it's not all terrible. There are individuals and there are courses and there are institutions which are good. The University of Buckingham, for example, is excellent. So it's looking at it's shopping around, and it's not actually shopping around in the way that, oh well, it must be Red Brick or it must be Oxbridge because that's a good education. Unfortunately, that isn't the case anymore.
Before we move on to the next subject, I just wanted to ask you if you'd seen that footage which is particularly interesting because Antifa are not particularly prominent in the UK. They're more in the United States and in places like Germany, within Europe in Germany. That earlier this week there was footage shared online of protests taking place with a women's rights activist being shoved around and threatened by
in Manchester,
someone who looked like they were Antifa. They had the black bloc on and so on. Again, defended by J.K. Rowling quite incredibly. Maybe we can put that tweet up too. And what was astounding about this clip was that it seemed as if, rather than stopping the person who was harassing the woman, the police officer seemed to be giving a talking to the woman who was really just assaulted. Really, really worrying state of affairs that a woman who is she was raising a flag with the colours of the suffragettes on it and protesting for women's rights, that we are now in a state of affairs where there'd be a counter-protest that was that aggressive and almost violent towards the women, and the police just allowed it to take place.
Biological men as well.
Yeah,
biological
presumably.
men.
I mean, they were wearing black blocks, so you can't really tell.
It's exactly the same thing as the child. It's exactly the same thing as the child in the school, isn't it? It's just a different context.
Bullies.
It's just a different context. It's bullies, but bullies under a flag of virtue.
Oh, it's appalling, but I'm afraid I have. I'm not surprised.
No shock. You've got no shock left.
Not with the police. Sorry, I'm not trying to sound like a smart aleck or anything. But not with the police. I think that they have, been absolutely imbued with this whole doctrine so thoroughly. Yeah. And obviously we've had Harry Miller on a number of times, and he runs something called Fair Cop, isn't it? We Fair Cop, Cop or something. And basically he's always highlighting these sort of things as well. And it goes through all the police forces in the country. And it's just, you look at this and you sort of think, this is appalling, but I'm not shocked. I'm not shocked, really. They would go for her, because they feel that they are now the proponents and the enforcers of the correct ideology.
So
that's what they feel they are.
Antifa would rightly be described as, particularly in the United States, given their propensity for violent protest, would rightly be regarded as being far left extremists. But this week also in the news, there's been a leak from the Prevent review that's being undertaken at the moment by William Shawcross.
Prevent being the
Prevent strategy, which is the government strategy to prevent people from being drawn into violent extremism. It has an ideological component because of the ideological component within terrorism, particularly in Islamist terrorism. However, the point is that in this leak, the suggestion is that this review is going to suggest that actually there's too much focus on far-right extremism, so as opposed to Islamist extremism, because now the proportion of channel referrals, so this is people who refer to Prevent and then go on to have some kind of help, I think it's something like 2/3 of those far-right cases are now far-right, and the question is whether or not that is representative of an actual change in the ways, an actual change in the nature of extremism within the United Kingdom, or whether that is representative of an over-focus on far-right extremism as opposed to Islamist extremism, that perhaps people are not making referrals because they are afraid of being accused of racism if they refer someone for Islamist extremism, because there is a campaign on campus against Prevent that is very closely related to issues to do with stigmatising Muslims because of terrorism and so on. So what's interesting about this leak is that it suggests that, and I should have mentioned actually that one of the categories for referral is something called mixed, unstable and unclear ideology. So this suggests that there's too much focus on far right. Do you think that there is too much of a focus on far right extremism?
Well, we're talking today, and one of the headlines is a 13-year-old boy has just been arrested for suspected Islamist, I should say, dissemination of hate material. Yes, I think there is, because we know, don't we, that if there's an Islamist attack, then we don't look back in anger. We take a look at ourselves. We take a look at society. We take a look at what's going wrong. But if there's a far right attack, my God, we go for it. Then we allow ourselves that hatred, the cathartic nature of letting that out, because that's the only avenue of expression, and we can't do that. I mean, we just see it all the time. Is that because we
feel more ownership over it as a society? So Dr. Paul Stott, who's at Policy Exchange, wrote a fantastic piece. I actually tweeted it out of the in the Times Thunderer, where he mentioned that that we seem to be happier to focus on far right, or more comfortable focusing on far right ideology, the ideological component, than we are in focusing on the ideological component of Islamist extremism. Do you think that's true?
Well, who's the we here?
We as in...
sorry, I'm not being facetious to you, but this is what I love, when they do these pieces. Why is it we are happy or we seem happy? I always think, who's this we? Majority of people reading this stuff
Paul's
at
defense,
home.
I don't think he said we. It's me saying we.
No,
and I said we before, but it was very much in inverted commas.
Yes, but it's this kind of like we're happy. No. Look, this has been going on for some time, actually. I mean, what it is, it's an attempt to raise the far right threat or whatever, to somehow, I would say, in all way, to kind of slightly diminish the Islamist one.
It's been called Rowleyism, the idea that in order to focus on Islamist extremism, you have to justify it by focusing on the far right, and you have to have some kind of equivalence there. Otherwise, it would be politically incorrect to focus just on the Islamism.
Yeah, well, yes, but I mean, I think that Prevent was started up, you could tell me this, because obviously you've done a lot of work in radicalisation, but it did have a strong motive, which was born of reality, which was that the vast majority of Islamic terrorist attacks were Islamist or Islamic fundamentalists, call it what you want. And that remains, I think, the case. I mean, in terms of, I think it's something like 90% of actually the attacks we've had over the past 20 years. And people, okay, it's been sort of relatively quiet recently.
But that doesn't mean a thing. There could be,
it absolutely does.
There could be a nail bomb tomorrow.
Yes, just 5 years ago, people have got such short memories. Just 5 years ago, 6 years ago, we had the worst attacks on France. Poor France. I mean, for about a year. Do you remember? It was the Bataclan Club. There was the 3 on Paris. Then there was on Nice, I think, the year after. It just went on and on. Priests getting their throats slit. All of this stuff. And so this is the reality of what we're facing, actually.
Do you think that part of the perception of the growing far right threat is based on, we've talked about this before, the influence of American politics and American culture on the UK, and the idea that we are the same as the US, that there have in very recent memory been far right incidents or attacks in the United States, and so the perception is that this therefore must also be an equivalent problem here?
No, I mean, well, there's no question. I mean, obviously there have been attacks. I mean, we had Anders Breivik as well in Europe. Obviously there have been, but the fact is, I think, from what I can gather from the leaks from this report, there is already the motivation to speak up, talk up the right-wing extremist threat. When they sort of say the right-wing extremist threat, that's not the same as saying terrorist threat, right, from what I can see. And I just remember from my experience of the way the police operate here, there are certain words they look out for in social media and such like, and some of them I would sort of think, wait a minute, these are actually perfectly acceptable positions to have.
So this is
I remember this coming up once when I was there, and in fact, at the time, police, the police there said, oh well, it's all about context. Yes, sure, okay, but is it, for example, a hard right extremist position to say I'd like to ban the burqa, for example? Is it? I'd say that is an absolutely legitimate argument. You can agree with it or not. But when they say that more and more things are being reported to prevent from the right, of the right.
Bear in mind as well that people who are referred are people who have explicitly not committed a crime. This isn't a criminal thing. This is to try and prevent them from engaging in some kind of violent activity.
So what if you do say, I want to, you've got someone saying, I feel we should ban the burqa, or I'm tired of mass immigration. Are these things, are they going to, for these, some of the more kind of, not just snowflakey, but some of the more kind of left-wing people, teachers, whatever it might be, if they're pupils, are they going to be thinking, someone to look out there, maybe keep an eye on? Would they be thinking that?
So I think the debate about free speech and prevent and whether they're compatible has been long and febrile pretty much from the very beginning of the prevent strategy being launched. And it's been something that has been used also to criticise saying that there are attacks on the free speech of the Muslim community and so on. So what I would be really interested to know is from this review, what sorts of things people are being referred to Channel 4, because very often these sorts of things can have serious mission creep, and particularly if you have a category called mixed, unstable and unclear ideology. Now, I've always been pro-prevent, I've been pro-dealing with these sorts of things. But if you have something that is that vague, what are the sorts of things people are being referred for? And is there proper parity? So are people who are being referred for concerns relating to Islamist extremism being taken, are those more serious referrals than otherwise, or what gets referred to in this very vague category? And also, what about all of the attackers in recent years who have been in contact with Prevent and have fobbed them off with something, or have
converting to Christianity,
and it's been unsuccessful, and therefore they've gone on to commit an attack. So I think that there are lots of elements to this, and that obviously this leak has been criticised very heavily because they're saying that Shawcross is anti-Islam and so on, and I don't think that he is whatsoever. But I think that actually that looking at these hard questions about Prevent and about the channel, the process of being involved in channel and so on, and issues to do with free speech and what people I think that is absolutely fundamental, because it's quite clear that Prevent strategy isn't working that effectively.
I think there's something else as well, and it's a very simple point, but it's worth making, is that the people who absolutely focused on far right ideology and marginalise any kind of Islamist terrorism are the people who've invested their whole lives in mass immigration, multiculturalism, and a view of the world that they don't want to see sullied at all. And it's very easy to just pick on one group and completely ignore another. It's an egregious, stupid thing to do, but hey, that's what they're like.
So just before we wrap up, because we're running short on time, let's move on to the last topic for this week, a fun one to end on. Black Lives Matter have been in the news again for their financial activities, shall we say. They have been reported to have spent $12 million on luxury properties in Los Angeles and Toronto.
Is that all?
And it is the latest in a string of cases of their financial wrongdoings. I think they had bought a house in a condo or something in the Bahamas as well. That was reported a while ago. And apparently this hasn't stopped them from being up to no good in terms of where they put the money that they have got through supporters over the protests in 2020, and probably still, I imagine, people are donating to them. So also, in addition to the 12 million on luxury properties, Black Lives Matter paid 1.8 million to the company, 1.8 million to the company's, the founder of the company, to her family members, her brother, the father of her child, for, quote, security and creative services. And one of the leaders of Black Lives Matter, so somebody who's now been put on the board, I don't know if they were when this money was donated, received, I think it's 90 million my mistake. 90 million is how much they got from the protests in 2020. 2.1 million is what was given to this consulting company of a woman who's now on the board. I just think that if this was any other organisation, then they would be hung up to dry for it.
It's one thing, I mean, and it's so ludicrous that you look at the figures and you think, my God, but if you just, it's not long ago, is it? 2020 when all of this stuff happened. You think about every single organisation and institution were signing up to this, and I remember putting up these statements of we support Black Lives Matter. The organisation as much as the concept, I think, knowing nothing about what's going on, completely nothing at all. And this is at the time when, was it Sasha Johnson, the leading figure, was tweeting things like, one day the white man will be the black man's slave. So, I mean, for me, that's the headline. This is small beer, and I'm not surprised.
Do you think it's going to sully their reputation, or do you think they'll?
Well, I think actually in an odd way, I don't think it will make much difference, but for different reasons. Is that I think like some people were calling this week saying, "Oh, for goodness' sake, isn't it time that you've all been had? Isn't it time that these footballers stop taking the knee to this organisation?" Well, they will get around that by just simply saying, "No, it was the essence, the principle, rather than the organisation." Even Keir Starmer said that I think when they started getting onto him about taking the knee, he said, "Well, it was a moment or something," he said. I think that, that is in some ways the genius of their name. It's a genius name. How can you possibly say, "Oh, they don't match"? But I don't, of course, you can't. And
I mean, it's probably important just to throw in here that it's a false premise, because I've never met anybody who doesn't think Black Lives.
Yes, exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
It's just
So that ties in neatly to what I was going to ask you as a sort of thought to end on.
Yeah.
That many people have criticised Black Lives Matter from the position, as the position that I take, which is that of the sort of traditional civil rights movement, Martin Luther King, judge a person by the content of their character, not the colour of their skin. And Black Lives Matter, capital letters, had hooked themselves onto this tradition, this civil rights tradition, attempting to portray themselves as the heirs to it. And obviously the civil rights movement, if you just think of the footage of people, marching and...
Incredible footage.
Those were your everyday, African Americans who were marching for equal rights.
Yeah.
These are people who don't believe in equality, but they believe in equity. And I just think that what an absolute disgraceful way to trample all over the inheritance of the civil rights movement, to take money that people donated. Many people will have donated money not knowing about the ideological aspects of Black Lives Matter, but just believing that they were donating to a cause for equality. That for that money to then be used and spent in this way, in millions,
it's grotesque.
I seems to me to be a particularly profound insult to the memory of someone like Martin Luther King, or those who marched in those civil rights movement marches.
But so much of it is a profound insult to them. Even the way in which Martin Luther King is now sort of on the cusp of being revised, as being an enabler.
Yeah. I mean, it's it's the most grotesque. I've used the word before, but grotesque distortion. But if one thing comes out of it, it's that people just shouldn't be so gullible for these knee-jerk reactions of things that on the surface seem to be completely virtuous, but you don't have to scratch much of the surface to find out what it's really like. Just take time before you sign up to these things.
I think that's a really good note to end on. So thank you, Peter, thank you, Philip, and
Thanks
thank you
very
for
much.
watching.
Yeah.
Please like and subscribe if you feel that way inclined, and we will see you next time on Newspeak.
Thank you.
Hello, if you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.